I'm going to hit that and we are good to go. Hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So thrilled to have you here on a Monday afternoon for a lunchtime chat and a continuance of our virtual author event series, which we have been doing since the onset of this pandemic. And we've done about almost 200 virtual events in that time and spoken to an amazing list of people, from ex-presidents to chefs to fiction writers to journalists and everybody in between. And it's been a really great way to stay tethered with you and have a connection in these strange, wacky, weird times that we're living in, but hoping to get back to some in-person things as case numbers go down and things get a little bit better. So stay with us on that. You can see our full list of events at magiccitybooks.com. And we have quite a few fun things still left for the rest of this year as well. So check that stuff out. But I want to get to the task at hand. Such a special, special day for us. I had the great privilege of meeting Mr. John Lithgow in my other life, which is working at the beautiful Philbrook Museum of Art here in Tulsa. And John was in Oklahoma doing a part in Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, which strangely coincidence, one of those weird, wacky things. We did the very first book event for that book when it came out. We did the book launch for that. So there's this kind of cyclical nature to everything we're doing now. But John wanted to come see the museum. And so we got to spend a day together, look around the museum, and really have some wonderful times chatting about art and everything else in between. And so it worked out perfectly that this new book, The Confederacy of Dumptys, which is the third book in this series looking at American power and despots and, of course, Donald Trump and everything else through the lens of poetry and these wonderful illustrations that John has done as well. The book's already a bestseller, following in the pattern of the two previous books. You've probably seen John doing some media around for this, but we are so thrilled that he was able to take some time out of his schedule and chat with us today. All of you watching, of course, have the book already, so you can join along with us as we do some readings, some other things. But please help me give a warm welcome to Mr. John Lithgow. John, great to see you.
Thank you. See you, Jeff. And it's John. So,
so good to see you. I was thinking back to the day we got to hang out and kind of look around the museum, and what struck me most after we got to spend some time together was, I've always been a fan of your work, and your enthusiasm for all the things in life that we were talking about kind of came through to me, whether it was we were talking about books or poetry or political cartooning or painting or whatever. You have such a wide kind of breadth and knowledge. I'm just curious to begin with, have you always been interested in all the kind of spokes on the wheel of art and culture? Obviously, you're known as an actor primarily, but you have all these other pursuits. Was it something that started first with your love of theater and acting and then started kind of offshooting into all these other places? Talk about some of the growth into this multiverse that is your life.
I think it started with my family. I had quite an unusual family. My father was a regional theater producer. He created and ran Shakespeare festivals in Ohio. One of them presented every single play in the Shakespearean canon over about 6 years, running in repertory, like 7 plays per summer. You could see a different Shakespeare play every night of the week. So I grew up with Shakespeare, for starters. And for some reason, I don't know quite why, I wanted to be an artist as soon as I was conscious. And I was quite serious about it as a young man, right up until the time I went off to college and discovered to my surprise that I was a very experienced actor, just from pure osmosis. And of course, at college, you fall in with the group that wants you, and that was the theater group. And I've always said, if you hear enough laughter and applause at a young age, you're going to be an actor, whether you want to or not. I've maintained my life as an artist just purely as a hobby, Christmas cards and opening night gifts to the cast of Broadway shows. I've finally gone public with the sort of lighthearted illustrations of the Dumpty books. But I've often thought about the road not taken with painting and printmaking. As for all the other arts, I was just so embedded in this extraordinary community of actors who worked for my dad, New York actors who came out to the hinterlands to do Shakespeare every summer. And I was accustomed to just having music, art, poetry, drama, dance, just they were parts of our lives. I never trained in music, and that's one thing I always regretted. But that hasn't stopped me from performing with major orchestras and devising Child's Guide to the Orchestra concerts and writing books for kids. I don't know, it's just, I am a kind of enthusiast. Part of it all, of course, is my day job. I am an actor, but I have stayed curious my entire life. Because of the acting profession, I've gone to loads and loads of cities in the world, and always the first thing I do as soon as I have a free couple of hours is go to the art museum. And that's what I did in Tulsa, and that's how we met. And that's why
we met. Yeah, that's our meet cute. That was our meet cute. So I wanted everybody to have a kind of a taste of what we're in for today. So this is the third, as you mentioned, in this series of Dumpty books, but it's quite different in the sense of you had a direct focus for the previous two, shall we say. And this book turns the eye away from Donald Trump and we're kind of at a Star Wars moment. We're doing a prequel of sorts here. We're looking at the road that led to him. We're looking at, a couple of dozen plus of these scoundrels that kind of paved the way for the politics of today. Maybe you could kind of start us off with one of the intro pieces and kind of lay the groundwork for us.
Great. And Jeff, I have to say, you are so good at this. You just said everything that I have been trying to squeeze into every single interview. It saved me so much time. But read the prologue, which in a sense restates exactly what you just said. It introduces you to this book, to its subject, its concept, its theme, and its intention. It's called Trumpty Dumpty Was Losing the Race. Prologue. Trumpty Dumpty was losing the race. A scowl beclouded his bright orange face. Watching his margin increasingly widen, he raged at his nemesis, Sleepy Joe Biden. The turbulent years of the POTUS's reign had shortened his temper and addled his brain. Like a latter-day Nixon, Capone, or Iago, he prowled the precincts of lush Mar-a-Lago. I won, he inveighed. It's a load of fake news. That nitwit's a loser, and I never lose. In a fever, he frantically seized on a plot to rally his base for a bold coup d'etat. From thence, Dumpty throttled our national life over 2 gruesome months of contention and strife. Political discourse was drowned in the muck by the quackery spewed by our manic lame duck. His treachery finally came to fruition. He stirred up his mob to an act of sedition. They laid siege in response to his rash exhortation to Biden's electoral certification. We watched them despoiling the Capitol dome like the Visigoths storming the portals of Rome. Horrors, we cried. He's let anarchy loose. We've never beheld such despotic abuse. But never, my friends, is an awfully long time. Our history's replete with corruption and crime. Scoundrels abound and their damage is ample. Dumpty is merely the latest example. And so for the moment, leave Dumpty aside and try to take all his offenses in stride. The voters have finally shown him the door. We've arrived at a time to revive and restore. Since we don't have to deal with this swine anymore, let's remember the Dumptys who've all gone before. And then off you go into the book.
Yeah, that's quite a beginning, and it's hard to get the word Visigoths into a poem these days, So you did a great job. I'm curious. I was thinking about the fact that I used the reading of history, especially over these past 5 years, as the world kind of seemed tipsy turvy, to find solace in the fact that we've been there before. I think people use it as coping mechanisms to kind of understand that, there's nothing new under the sun. And the fact that we've seen troubled times before and gotten through them gave me some kind of fuel to kind of keep going when I would be feeling down or somewhat defeated. Is that true for you as well? Do you look to history for those lessons?
I have never quite done that before, but I certainly did it this time. And my feeling was very much like yours. The first two books were big successes, bestsellers, and my publisher, of course, wanted me to write a third to complete a trilogy. And I was exhausted by the process, tired of the subject. But actually, my wife, who is an economic and business historian at UCLA, she's the one who said, well, wait a minute, John, hold on. Why not look backward in history? Why not find Dumpty's precursors? There's all sorts of undiscovered and half forgotten and completely forgotten history that is very instructive, and it's delightful. These are extraordinary characters. So she steered me to some of her colleagues, and I myself reached out to kind of famous public historians like Rachel Maddow and John Meacham and Walter Isaacson for just bright ideas and composed this database. The reason I said yes and pressed on with it was just exactly what you said. Here was an opportunity to, in fact, write something hopeful, write something that is a relief rather than a bummer. It's very hard to read the news even today when things are supposedly looking up, because these are dark times. The divisiveness in America has not gone away. Well, it's always been there, and we've always survived. There's an extraordinary subject of one of the poems. It's called Centennial Day, 1876, which is a meditation on that contested election. We heard a lot about that election during our last contested election. That was when, by a compromise, Rutherford B. Hayes became our president. And basically, the South won a kind of redo on the Civil War. It was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow. Well, it's very, very important that we understand what happened that year, because there is such resonance of that right now. And yes, we survived, but that was a catastrophic year for African Americans in this country. That was there's a line in the poem where I say, the ex-Confederates crowed with their faces all aglow, "You can have your president if we can have Jim Crow." Well, that in one line summarizes what happened that year. That's what happens when you go back in history with a view to understanding better what's happening right now.
It's having written these three books, it's very obvious where you stand politically. But it's interesting to me. I just saw you recently in this great documentary called On Broadway. You're one of those talking heads there, and they're kind of looking at kind of the rise and fall of Broadway and how it keeps coming and going back and everything. Anyway, I was thinking about the fact that it's no surprise that you've always probably leaned left on the political spectrum, and obviously kind of in the world of acting and entertainment, that's not anything new. But in the 1970s or 80s or even 90s, when you were doing work, it wasn't as if you were having to talk about it as publicly as you do now, and it wasn't probably as tied to your persona as it is now, having done this work. The reason I'm bringing that up is, you, for example, played Roger Ailes famously in the movie Bombshell, the founder of Fox News, for those who do not know that name. But there's also that story that where you'll hear actors say, you know, whoever I play, I have to find the sympathy in that character. Knowing how you think about this stuff, how do you play someone like him, who you obviously disdain everything that he did and has wrought? How do you do those, and how do you find a balancing act between those two things?
Well, an extraordinary story to tell you. In preparing to play Roger Ailes, and not, he was clearly going to be the villain of this movie. I mean, it's a movie about his downfall and about the courage of the women at Fox to stand up and turn on him. But I don't think any villain, I think every villain in any piece of fiction or nonfiction becomes far more interesting if you understand him a little bit, if you see different sides to him. I tracked down an old friend of mine from the 1970s who once worked for a couple of years with Roger Ailes as his producing partner when Roger was attempting to be a New York theater producer. In fact, he produced the very first New York production of Hot L Baltimore back in the 70s by Lanford Wilson. I tracked down my old friend Steve, and I said, tell me about Roger back in those days. And he was very upset at what history had done to Roger Ailes. He was appalled by Roger Ailes' behavior at Fox and elsewhere, just like everybody else. But he said, nobody has acknowledged what great company he was, what a sense of humor he had, how this man you could laugh with him for like 40 seconds on end at a single joke. This was a man who he really did like, if not love. He loved working with him, and he was terribly upset at what history had done to him. This was fantastic news to me, because it helped me play that part enormously. You have to approach every role with empathy just to understand it. Even Iago, Richard III, Yellow Iachimo in Cymbeline. Shakespeare knew his villains, but he gave them all those facets too.
When you wrote the first in the series of the Dumpty books, were you expecting, and that, you know, that's at the height of, you know, Trump is on social media nonstop. Did you expect any like direct response from him or his camp? Did you ever get any direct response from him or his people when you were doing these work?
You will be
get called out in some way.
You will be astonished to know I haven't heard a whisper from anybody. I hear nothing but right on, John. Maybe it's because it's the nature of communication in this day and age that people only hear what they want to hear. But no, I expected to get slammed much harder from the right. And it's interesting. Yes, I suppose you could call me left wing. I grew up with FDR lefties for sure. They adored everything Franklin Roosevelt stood for, and this is in my DNA. But I consider myself a centrist. I feel all of society has shifted to the left, to the right, to the point where, you know, being a centrist is being a moderate, such a moderate. To me, I'm a rationalist. I look at what is right and what is wrong. And I look at justice and injustice, and I look at the rule of law, and I look at outlaws. I wrote a pair of poems. One is called A Grand Old Party Part 1, Happy 50th, about a fictional Watergate reunion, 50th reunion of all the alums of Watergate. All but one or two of them went to jail. The second one is called A Grand Old Party Part 2, Happy New Year. It's about a fictional New Year's Eve party of all the Trump alums. The ones who did do a very, very short time in jail, and there were only 3 or 4 of them, their sentences were commuted, they were completely forgiven, and all the rest of them have gone unindicted. So that's what's happened. I mean, the rule of law has been so compromised, and that's the kind of thing I sort of scream out against. But I do it in comic verse. mainly because I remain an entertainer, even though I've sort of come out of the shadows as a satirist and as a political voice.
I want to incorporate some questions while we go here a little bit. One just is perfect for what you just said. This is from one of our viewers who says, should satire tickle or stab?
What a nice question. My compliments to your audience. I think it should do both. Some of my poems are very funny. It is interesting to note that just about all the Trump administration subjects that I wrote about from in the past tense, Trump had turned on them, fired them, defamed them, drummed them out of office by the time my book came out, satirizing them. I wrote a poem about Brad Parscale when he was riding high in the second book, called The Invisible Man. And it made ruthless fun of Brad Parscale for being such a Trump toady. Look at what happened to that poor man. In his briefs, held down in handcuffs, cuffed by cops, desperate and drunk. This was a defeated man, all because of his association with Donald Trump. And
fired because of the rally he messed up in Tulsa, I should note.
Yes, exactly. There's your Tulsa connection right there. This you could find a similar story about just about everyone who worked for him. He ruined their lives. And by the time I got around to satirizing them, or by the time my satire arrived in print, all of them were poor dead horses that I was beating. And that's you say, do they tickle or do they stab? Well, they can tickle you, they can stab you, and you can end up feeling very sorry for them.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting what you said about kind of the stink of this thing that they can't get off of them once they kind of enter that fray. And it reminds me of that great Hollies song, King Midas in reverse, this King Midas touch in reverse.
Yeah.
I wonder though, having looked at the folks that you look at in this new book, obviously that's one thing you didn't have to worry about. Their reputations were cemented. You're looking back at these people, but knowing history as you do, who are a couple of the people in the book that you were not familiar with, or some stories of some history that were totally, hey, how did I miss this one?
Yeah, that is one aspect. It's one thing that distinguishes this book from the other two. There are people you've never heard of, and they are quite an extraordinary discovery. And the amazing thing about these people is in their day, they were just as famous as Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones and Sidney Powell, but they're totally forgotten. Good examples are John Romulus Brinkley, the goat gland doctor, who was virtually the founder of radical right-wing talk radio in the 1920s and used quack medicine as a way of making himself famous. That's one of them. Another great one is Sarah Howe, a Boston con woman who created pyramid schemes taking advantage of sort of naive women, many of them sort of old maids with their husbands, widows with their husbands' fortunes. A fascinating character, as I say about her. Give her a cheer. She beat Carlo Ponzi by 42 years. Another crackpot character named Theodore Bilbo, a crazy Dixiecrat who died in 1947 after many years as a United States senator. A hateful bigot whose solution to the Depression unemployment was to send Black people back to Africa. I mean, instances like that, it's like, wow, is this nation capable of producing despicable people like this? The answer is yes.
I wonder, this is kind of, it's a little bit of a dark question, but I wonder, do you think that looking through all of these incidences of attempted authoritarianism, all these things that you kind of touch on, and you show that people have kind of had these impulses over the whole existence of the United States. Is the experiment of liberal democracy that we've tried here in America too fragile, do you think? Is the default for most societies to kind of go back towards those kind of spaces where it's like we have to really work at this thing to keep it going, and that if we don't, and I guess it kind of speaks to, I'm answering my own question here a little bit, but that famous, I think it's somewhat apocryphal, that famous quote, I believe, that Benjamin Franklin, told the woman, a democracy, if you can keep it. There's that famous line. But, is there kind of a default setting that we're always in danger of falling back to? Do you see it that way?
Yeah, yes, of course. It's a moment of deep fear, I think, for democracy. These years have shown us how fragile democracy is. We've never had a president who's had these despotic urges. I mean, there have been power-hungry presidents, but not at the expense of our entire political system. It's quite terrifying and quite chilling. It's an interesting thing to write, to write doggerel verse about these subjects when the subjects are so very dark. Exactly halfway through this process, January 6th took place. And here I was writing about Nathan Bedford Forrest and Andrew Jackson and George Armstrong Custer, 19th century people who are comfortably far away from us. There's a great distance between us and them in time and space. But this was something very immediate and quite terrifying. And I realized I have to address this full on in this book. I have my ending. And the last poem in the book, it's called Dumpty's Dream, and I call it my little mini Iliad. It is a poetic recounting of all the events from the dawn of January 6th to the dawn of January 7th. And it's a deadly serious poem, even though it's full of crackling wit. I intended it to be a disruptive poem and to really unsettle people because, I mean, here we are almost a year past Dumpty's electoral defeat. And if anything, he's more of a danger than ever.
We have a kind of a comment / question here from one of our guests, and they say, this is referencing your character in the Shrek films, Lord Farquaad. And it says, did you ever think that a line from Lord Farquaad would be so accurately used in the last 4 years of political / human emotions? And the line is, though some of you may die, that's a risk I'm willing to take.
Oh my God. It always amazes me when people quote my lines back to me that I have completely forgotten.
Especially animated lines.
Yeah, right. Even little children will come up and quote my lines to them.
Yeah,
it's like a good line to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a great character, little Lord Farquaad.
Yeah, had some authoritarian impulses for sure.
Oh God, yes.
I'm curious, just on that note, you've had such a long career, and you have so many. As we talked at the very beginning of this, you've done so many things that your kind of generational reach is all over the place. So some, millennials know you for Shrek, or some of your kids' books, or anything else. Then you have like your Brian De Palma devotees, and whoever it is.
Yeah.
What's that like? I mean, is it kind of interesting? Because I would imagine a lot of your peers and your contemporaries don't have that same opportunity to really, you have fans from 10 to 100.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing. I mean, an actor has to sort of acknowledge and embrace the fact that everything he does will soon be forgotten. It's very much of the moment. Some of my favorite experiences, some of the best work I've ever done is from 40 and 50 years ago, and it's long forgotten. It's past history. So when there are people who come up and say, I saw you in the changing room on Broadway, I was in 1973, I'm just elated. And it's a nice thing to go through life with that happening now and then. Of course, it happens less and less. And the ghost of John Lithgow will not hear that ever. It's all gone. But that, you've got to savor the excitement of it. What I do is lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
You do a hit play on Broadway and it's gone forever. You even do a movie and it has a sell-by date too. I mean, I've done some great films and people saw them and they remember them, but they haven't watched them again in 40 years.
Yeah. Let's talk about the illustrations for a second. They're just very, lovely and whimsical. And we were talking a little bit about Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is, probably the first great American political cartoonist, and is, very much known for having, a lot of people see, like, for example, the donkey and elephant imagery for the political parties. This is traced back to Thomas Nast. He had a huge impact on American culture, but he also had a certain line and a certain style. You talk about Thomas Nast in the book, but also I'm just curious, what would you describe your style of illustration? What are you kind of going for when you're doing these?
Well, it's got an immediacy to it. I draw very carefully, but I love to create the impression that I've dashed it off. So there's a very quick communication. It's the stopping off place between the poem and me. It's all of the illustrations, they have the same humor as the poems. They have visual punchlines. They're political cartoons. And I do have my heroes among political cartoonists, like Gerald Scarfe or Herblock from the 1950s. Herblock's renderings of Richard Nixon and Joe McCarthy were imprinted on me from my childhood. And in a sense, that's kind of what I'm after. I don't presume to call myself a political cartoonist. I'm still an amateur. I could have been if I had not taken the little off-ramp and become an actor. But Thomas Nast, who, by the way, you must give the Philbrook a shout out. They have a gigantic collection of original Thomas Nast drawings, which I'm dying to see the next time I visit the museum. He's the only good guy in my entire book. Everybody's a scoundrel except Nast. And I put him in a poem partnering him with Boss Tweed, because he's the one who brought Boss Tweed down. We all know who Boss Tweed is now, but mainly because Thomas Nast chose to caricature him. So my poem is called Nasty Business, the Tale of Boss Tweed. Nasty Business, of course, is a pun. And it's about the nature of satire itself. It's about how, we simply wouldn't know what William Tweed looked like. We wouldn't know anything about his history. As it is, we don't know much, but we know that he was a bad guy in New York during a very corrupt time. We only know about that because someone chose to satirize him. Mm. So that's what I'm doing. As I say in the foreword, the introduction to the second book, I wrote these poems with 3 intentions: to make you laugh, to make you mad, and to make you remember. Thomas Nast he made us remember Boss Tweed. Yeah, and I will show you.
Yes, please.
It's a little kind of Tom Doyle. You see Boss Tweed being drawn by Thomas Nast, being drawn by me. You can recognize me by my bald head and my cardigan.
Yeah. It's very good. That famous Rockefeller painting, of him painting himself.
Yes, exactly right. By the way, he was one of my heroes growing up, and I met him as
You met Norman Rockwell?
I met Norman Rockwell. My father took a sabbatical year. We all lived in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, about 100 yards from Norman Rockwell's studio. And I can't believe my chutzpah. I took a book of his plates of his paintings and carried them right up to his studio to have him sign them. signed my book.
Wow.
I even took a Kodak picture of him.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. He's someone who feels so iconic and American that he's like Betsy Ross or something at this point.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I'm curious, a couple of final questions. You mentioned this, of course, as a trilogy. You know, who knows what's to come? But I had a great time reading your memoir, by the way. If people haven't read your memoir, I would encourage them to do so. It really gave me a lot of insight into you, and just to be prepared for our chat here. But it was also just a romp and really a fun read too. Do we see any more of that type of writing coming down the pipe?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm an actor. I'm accustomed to not knowing what comes next, and not even relying on my own impulses. I tend to act on other people's brainstorms. This entire book was the bright idea of my literary agent after I sang a comic song at a public theater gala. I rewrote the lyrics of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta and performed the song in the person of Michael T. Flynn. And he said, "This do political satire." And that was the start of that. So who knows? I suspect I will be asked to write something else. And I will spend about 15 minutes concentrating very, very hard on what that should be. And I will suggest that probably to my literary agent. And he will say, "Don't bother." And he'll give me another idea. And I'll write another book.
Over the pandemic and kind of that quarantine period, I'm just curious, what your reading habits are like. Aside from scripts and things, what's on your bedside table most nights? What do you like to read? What are you kind of always interested in? Is it as diverse as your other interests, like we've been talking about here?
Yes, I'm a slow reader. I an enthusiastic reader, but I'm slow and I'm unreliable. I confess to losing the thread and discarding books when they're half read far too often. But when I find a novel that I love, I'm consumed by it. As I grow older, my attention span is a little strained. So I've taken to reading Tobias Wolff's stories at the moment. That's sitting next to my bed.
Can't go wrong with those.
Oh my God, they're so brilliant. And you can read one or two on an airplane ride. Yeah. And you're in no danger of discarding a novel halfway through. I've read a couple of fabulous pieces of nonfiction this year, mainly because I've been so immersed in politics. I've read the great journalism of Phil Rucker and Carol Leonnig on the Trump administration. That was a deep dive. And when I find a great novel, I just swallow it whole.
Yeah.
Mainly a novel reader.
Had you read Killers of the Flower Moon before you even were cast?
No, I had not read it, had not even heard of it. That script was sent to me, 180-page movie script, which is long. I read it start to finish, and I was completely overwhelmed. I had no idea what I was in for reading this story. I'm sure it was people's experience reading the book. Yeah. Read the book afterwards, and it was even better than the screenplay. But the movie is going to be the best of all.
Well, I'm going to share a piece of advice with you. So there's a wonderful writer named Nancy Pearl who does a lot of book reviews for NPR and all kinds of things.
Yes.
She has this thing called the 50-page rule. This is also for everyone watching too. And her rule is this, because people always ask, how the hell do you keep up with all the reading and everything? And she says, here's my rule. If you're under age 50, you have to read at least the first 50 pages of every book before you can decide you want to discard it, okay? But
that's pretty.
Every year over 50, you get to take one page off that 50.
I love that. Yeah. I love that. Now that's the advice of a bookseller.
Yeah, and so she says, if you live to be 100, you can finally judge a book by its cover. That's
that's completely wonderful. I did read a fantastic novel very recently, which I have to insist all your readers and listeners read, and that's Shuggy Bain.
Yeah, this won the Booker Prize
Yeah,
last year.
completely fantastic novel. And
Yeah.
the audiobook is even better because they found an actor with this extraordinary range of Glaswegian accents.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Well, John, this has been just a blast. I have so much respect for you and all the work that you do, and it was a treat to meet you, and also get to kind of carry on and do this conversation as well. So thank you so much for taking some time.
Now listen, I am perfectly willing to stay on and read one poem.
Well, I'm going to end you. I'm queuing you up for that. I'm queuing you up for that.
Great. Well, I will take your thanks, and I will thank you in return, Jeff.
But we're going to end with some dirty limericks, right? Are we going to end with dirty limericks? Yeah.
Yes, I can read that Happy New Year poem that I referred to, and I read the dirty limericks. That's about, I would say, 3.5 minutes worth of doggerel verse.
Perfect.
Okay. Happy New Year. A Grand Old Party, Part 2. Dumpty funsters, ere you leave, share one final New Year's Eve. 2020's almost done, likewise all your DC fun. 4 long years flew by too fast, power and glory never last. Celebrate your single term, all the drang and all the sturm. Answered Dumpty's siren call, Mar-a-Lago's New Year's Ball. Wait a second. This is queer. 10 to midnight, no one's here. Where are all the invitees? Fetch me those RSVPs. Scaramucci missed his flight. Seculo mistook the night. Pruitt's Cadillac broke down. Dershowitz is out of town. Someone slashed Jeff Sessions' tire. Conway set her stove on fire. Larry Kudlow has a cold. Wilbur Ross is too damned old. Bolton stumbled on a stair. Rudy couldn't fix his hair. Michael Cohen's still in jail. No one's heard from Brad Parscale. Pence, Mnuchin, and Perdue thought they might have caught the flu. Spicer, Price, DeVos, and Barr said Palm Beach was just too far. Bannon, Chow, and Cipollone, more excuses, all baloney. But look who made it, just in time. Each unburdened of his crime, free to live a life of ease, Dumpty's recent pardonees. Arriving first is Roger Stone, but he hasn't come alone. On his heels, Paul Manafort slurps a Jeroboam of port. Gliding in is Michael Milken, his demeanor sly and silken. Papadopoulos is late, half hefting in a heaping plate, next to portly Elliot Broidy, braying loud and adenoidy. Charles Kushner enters, flushed with pride, Dinesh D'Souza by his side, joining tipsy Michael Flynn, bourbon dribbling down his chin. Halting chatter tinged with gloom echoes in the empty room. Counting down, they raise a toast, honoring their absent host. Flutes of cheap champagne are down as the chimes of midnight sound. Bring on 2021. Another year has just begun. Meanwhile, in his private suite, Dumpty wallows in defeat. Around him, equally bereft, the only trustees he has left, Miller, Hicks, and McEntee, plus the Dumpty family. None can manage to cajole him, raise his spirits, or console him. Huddled round his slippered feet, their desolation is complete. A distant roar of drunken cheers falls on deaf, unheeding ears. At last, that old familiar line, the final words of Auld Lang Syne.
Yes.
The illustration based on archival photos of one of Mar-a-Lago's grand banquet rooms.
My favorite line is braying and adenoidy. I like adenoidy. That's my favorite word.
Yes. Actually, the second book has a whole poem about Broidy, and I managed to rhyme it with schadenfreude and annoyed he. Yeah. A lot of fun. The adjective tabloidy, you've heard that before. And finally, limericks for the here and now. You know, the book is a kind of historical chronology that takes you up to the present day. So these are very close to the end. And some of you might have seen some of these on the Colbert Show last week. So apologies for repeating myself. Until now, we have dwelt on the past, but before we arrive at the last, here's a dozen quick takes about rascals and rakes from our reprobate present day past. Ted Cruz, that lardacious baboon, is the maestro of inopportune. With his state in deep freeze, this titan of sleaze took his family off to Cancun. Giuliani, a freak among freaks, tends to blunder whenever he speaks. His clumsiest mess was in front of the press, just for men, trickled down both his cheeks. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a fountain of hatred and spleen. When she opens her trap, her fanatical crap can shatter a video screen. Joel Greenberg and buddy Matt Gaetz share several libidinous traits. When both of them score, they tend to ignore the age of consent of their mates. The NRA's Wayne LaPierre, always dressed with extravagant flair, but he emptied the till for his toggery bill, and now he has nothing to wear. Mike Lindell is the boss of My Pillow, whose ego continues to billow. But despite his renown, his head's full of down, and he's thick as a sick armadillo. Alex Jones has a fiendish ability to monetize rank imbecility. The best of his tricks is to use politics to sell cures for diminished virility. Stefanik, in making her mark, was as silent and swift as a shark. She slid in to ensnare her conference chair, while Liz Cheney became Joan of Arc. Sidney Powell, the POTUS's minion, replaced fact with outlandish opinion, but she trembled with fear for her tarnished career when she learned she'd been sued by Dominion. Ms. Maxwell was Epstein's old flame until both were consumed by their shame. But in all their shared history, the thorniest mystery is how to pronounce her first name. Republican Rube, Ron DeSantis, dreams of ruling a bold new Atlantis. But with Dumpty behind him, it's best to remind him what becomes of the male praying mantis. Lindsey Graham, that browbeaten fawn, is anyone's pliable pawn. He faces travail with the balls of a snail and the spine of a groveling prawn. Each McConnell political act has a physiologic impact. For Mitch, legislation connotes constipation of the nation's intestinal tract. From these verses, you might be inclined to consider each target maligned. But compared to their smears of the recent few years, my words have been overly kind.
What a perfect way to end, and also a great way to start the week with a little bit of snark. One of those people. But John, this has been a blast, and thank you so much for your time, and can't thank you enough.
Well, I'll see you back in Tulsa and at the Philbrook and at Magic City Books.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
I'm so delighted that we've gotten to know each other.
Yeah, same here. Same here. Take care. We'll see you both soon. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye, Tulsa.